Good morning. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. I will make my presentation in English because it's about 50 minutes long. It's quite, there's a lot of geopolitical concepts, so in Chinese it will be a little bit difficult for me and very tiring for you. So I will proceed in English, but for the Q&A session, please feel free to ask me in Chinese or in English. Both will be fine. So this book was written 2 years ago, and the topic is the relationship between China and the West. The West, I basically is Western Europe and the US. And for this presentation, I want to focus on Europe, what it means for Europe to be in the middle of basically the US, the Anglo-American empire, which is until recently a unipolar power, because until now America was ruling over the world without any competitor. But recently, we've seen countries like China and Russia, but also Iran and Brazil and some other countries like this becoming other centers of power in the world, which are challenging the American unipolar power. So Europe, Western Europe, is kind of in the middle between these two centers of power and having a difficulty to choose its side, let's say. So from the Chinese point of view, I want to explain that China want to have a good relationship with Europe, but Europe being ruled by the EU, then it's the European countries are not free to exactly do what they want in their relationship with China. So the first thing I want to let you know where it all comes from. If you are only reading the news outlets on the left-hand side here, including the South China Morning Post here, but also the Financial Times, Economist, you will probably think that I'm coming from a different planet. Because what I do, the discipline I give to myself every day pretty much is to read both sides. On the left-hand side, which everybody is reading, but also on the right-hand side, which is newspapers from China, news outlets from China, from Russia, from Iran, from India, because it's very important to have the point of view of these emerging economies. And bear in mind that the people who read this news on the left-hand side is basically the Western Europe and America and some countries which are close to them. But it's only 13% of the world population. The other 87% of the world population is reading the stuff on the right-hand side. So in order to understand really the dynamics of the world geopolitics, it's important to have the point of view of both sides. Now, this power struggle between America, the Anglo-American empire, and the rest of the world, is it really, if you read the news also in Hong Kong, in the South China Morning Post, for instance, you keep seeing like very negative reporting about China, trying to depict China as an aggressive power, as a power that wants to replace America. And basically, the question you should ask yourself is it really about China? Is it really about Russia? We see the war in Ukraine. We see they keep talking about potential conflict with the Philippines or with Taiwan. But is it really about Russia and China? And my point is that it's not. Basically, we have to go back to the theory of geopolitics from the early 20th century. And there were two people, two geopoliticians who had their own theory about how the Anglo-American empire would be able to control the world, because this is really what their objective is. One theory is a gentleman called Mackinder, and this gentleman wrote a book called The Geopolitical Pivot of History, Geographical Pivot of History in 1904. And basically his logic was that who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland being this huge piece of land here in Eurasia, which is where most of China is. Who controls the heartland controls the world island being Eurasia, right here. And who rules the world? Ireland commands the world. So this is the first theory that appeared in 1904. And then in 1920, there was another gentleman from the UK who came up with a more sophisticated theory related to this one, but more sophisticated. And he said, he was called the godfather of containment. And he said, basically, you don't have to control the whole island, the world island, to control the world. You just control the rimland, here, the blue part that you see here. And if you control these countries, basically you control the heartland and you control the world. So if you look at this blue rim right here, this is basically where the Anglo-American empire has been focusing its attention since the beginning of the 20th century. All the wars that you've been hearing about, whether it's the First and the Second World War in Europe, the war in the Middle East right here, the colonization of India and all the Vietnam War and the Korean War and everything, it's all taking place around the heartland. And this is why the America, the Anglo-American empire, has been focusing its attention, because the objective is to control the whole place just by controlling the rim. Now, this is really what we are up against here is a battle between two systems of thought. One of them is here on the right-hand side, the US, UK, EU, and NATO, which basically are countries of liberal democracies. And what they do basically is that they're opposing any power that is emerging, like be it India or China or even Japan in the 1980s, when Japan was a very strong economy and very powerful country. Very quickly, America, although they are supposed to be allied countries, but America starting to be very strict with Japan in terms of economy, was talking about Japan as a threat. And so you see that America basically doesn't have any allies. You know, they say that Western Europe is an ally, Japan, Korea are allies, but really they're not. As soon as they start to become competitors, then they are treated like enemies. Now on the other side, we have two emerging superpowers. Russia first, which is it's an illiberal democracy because they have a voting, they have elections and everything, but it's not a Western style liberal democracy. They, of course, have the military might for them, very strong, and which is the reason why America is so much against Russia right now. And Russia will not be coerced into becoming a liberal democracy like the US or like Western Europe. They were about to in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. For about 10 years, Russia was being pulled to the West. Vladimir Putin said that he would want Russia to become part of the EU. But this has changed in the past 15, 20 years. And then, of course, in the middle, we have China, which is causing the main problem for America and the Anglo-American empire, because it is so different from what America has been used to fight in the past. In the past, during the Cold War, America was fighting against communism. And it was very easy to say communism is bad. They don't have any elections. They are brutal with their own people. But China hasn't been like this for a very long time. What China is right now is a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. So it's like three concepts in one. 中国特色社会主义市场经济, right? So this is very difficult for America and for Western people to understand what this is, because yes, it is communist, but it's also very capitalistic, and on top of that, it's very Chinese. So, and this model, China, when you see the way China is behaving with the rest of the world, with Africa, with South America, with Middle East, you can see that China is actually showing that there don't have to be more wars around the world. You can have a relationship with those countries without telling them what kind of government they should have, what kind of economy they should have, what kind of society they should have. When China is engaging with countries around the world, it doesn't give conditions to doing business with China. You can do business with China without having a government that is pro-China. Whereas America always says, well, if you want to do business with America, you have to be a democracy. You have to have elections. You have to have LGBT rights. There's a lot of conditions, and the rest of the world is getting tired of this. So China all of a sudden has become a very strong diplomatic power, and we see that recently China was able to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran which broke their diplomatic relations in 2016, China brought them back together. So China is becoming this very important diplomatic power in the world. Now, of course, this is posing a big threat to the American hegemony, and so what America has been busy doing for the past 50 years is creating military bases all around the world. And actually these figures is not accurate anymore. Now it's more than 800 bases. And they're all located, if you look at it, they're all located around China and around Russia. So they can say whatever they want. They say, oh, we are fighting for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea or things like that. But this is not the case. The case is really containing and encircling China and Russia, which are the two biggest ideological enemies of the Anglo-American empire. And so why is it like this? Why is it that America is creating bases around the world and trying to convince everybody to follow the American model? Well, it's because America has this, from a very long time, from the 19th century, has this ideology that it's exceptional. This is a country that is above everybody else and has a mission to convert everybody to liberal democracy. And so they have this theory of being an exceptional country, and from the 19th century, America was calling itself a city upon a hill. This expression has been used by all the presidents of America, whether it's Kennedy, Reagan, Obama. They've been all saying that America is a city on the hill, or it's a beacon of hope, right? Or the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the EU, Josep Borrell, said, the EU is a garden, the rest of the world is a jungle. You know, so this is, and they're not joking, this is really what they have in their mind. They think like Western Europe and America are far ahead of the rest of the world, and they have this mission of converting the rest of the world to their ideas. You know? In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, was Prime Minister of UK, she even said, well, market economy is the best, it's right for everybody, and it's the only system that works, and that debate is over. It's called TINA, there is no alternative, right? And then in the 1980s, American writers, Francis Fukuyama, maybe you have read it, also Samuel Huntington, they wrote books saying the end of history. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed, America thought they won. As well, if communism is dead, then it means I won. So there's the end of history. There's nothing else. Now it's liberal democracy for everybody. And then they called it a class, and they said, well, if you don't become a liberal democracy like America, then you will have a clash of civilization, right? So basically it was like there's no alternative, you have to follow us or else you will have war, you know. And so back then, America was calling itself a lonely superpower because they said, well, we are the only superpower left in the world. Soviet Union has collapsed. China was not a big economy back then. And so America started to see the rest of the world in a very polarized way. Basically, if you remember during the first war of Iraq and also the second one, they said, you're either with us or you're against us. If you're not my friend, then you're my enemy. They would not let a space for other countries in the world to have their own opinion and their own diplomacy and their own way of conducting their affairs. But something bad happened for this big American plan is China's peaceful rise. And this has been really a big problem for America since the 1990s and especially since the 2000s. Why? Because China, contrary to Russia, China has a 360 degrees sovereignty. China territory is fully protected. China economy is very well protected from the Western influence. China technology is homegrown. China food is made in China. China financial system is protected. So China really has a 360-degree sovereignty, which European countries don't have, which Russia doesn't have, which Africa doesn't have, of course. So this is a very difficult country to control. It's very difficult for America to influence China. So that has become a very big problem. And on top of that, because China has become so powerful and influential, the rest of the world, the other developing countries, they're starting to see China as some kind of model. They think, well, maybe I shouldn't try to become like the US or like Europe. Maybe I should try to become like China. And so this is why all these organizations that you've heard about have started to become more and more important. You have BRICS, Jindran, you have Itailu, more than 160 countries joined. You also have the Shanghai 合作组织, right? More and more countries are joining. So this is all drifting away from America. People think like, well, now we have a choice and we can negotiate. We have a better negotiating position with America, because if you don't give me what I want, if you're not treating me fairly, then maybe I'm going to turn to China. And so China has been kind of oscillating between being very assertive, because every time America is attacking it for the past 30 years, China was not doing anything. This is what Deng Xiaoping called, like a high capacities, and by time Taoguang Yanghui. That was like the policy of Deng Xiaoping for the past 30 years. Said, let's not be confrontational with America. We take care of our own development, and then the day will come one day that eventually we can say no. And that day has come, and now China is using what the West is calling the wolf warrior diplomacy. 战狼外交嘛, right? So China sometimes has now has the position to say no, what you're saying doesn't work for me, so I'm not going to go this way. And America is not used to having any country saying no to them. No. But in order to keep the power, America is trying to portray China as a very aggressive country, or a country that is trying to replace America. But actually, China never had the ambition to become number one. China's only objective was to go back to its original position of the 19th century, when it was the first economy in the world since the 17th century. China was the richest country, was the number one country, but not a country that was going towards the rest of the world. It was very happy with being very powerful and very rich in itself, not trying to invade other countries and convince them to become like China. So China is actually a more inclusive economy. It's not excluding like America is doing, and it's working, and it's been repeating all over in the speeches of President Xi, but also all the foreign affairs, the foreign ministry people. They say we're trying to build a community of common destiny, right, for the rest of the world, and we want to have a harmonious existence with the rest of the world. Now, this is a completely different model, because China is not trying to force people into adopting its own system. China said what worked with China maybe doesn't work for Africa or doesn't work for South America, but each country has to find its own model of development. This is completely different from what America has been doing for the past century. So basically what's happening, because of China's rise, the world is shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And basically what China is saying, and Russia is saying the same, is saying basically now, of course, Washington, D.C. remains a center of power, but it's just one of them. Now you also have to deal with Moscow and with Beijing and with Brasilia and with Tehran, And so you're just one of the centers of power. And also the Russia and China relationship, it's a kind of a strategic partnership. It's not an alliance. It's not China and Russia are going to go to war together against America. They say we're not directing against America. We are just saying we are regional centers of power, and you have to respect us the same way we respect you. And so, as I said, they've been busy creating all these other organizations, which are potentially will be a competitor with the United Nations. The BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of these are attracting more and more members. And the difference with the United Nations or with NATO is that all the countries that are joining it, they are willing to join it. There's a lineup of countries wanting to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Same thing for the BRICS. It's the countries who are themselves asking to be part of it. It's not China going to them and say, hey, you have to be part of the club. So on the other side, when America and the Anglo-American Empire sees that the whole global South is joining Belt and Road Initiative, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, then the Anglo-American Empire is trying to strengthen its position with its own allies, Western Europe, Japan, Korea. And it's doing it in the only way it knows how to do is by being very brutal and say, you must be on my side. So from now on, France, Germany, UK, you must send your boats to the South China Sea and be part of the maneuvers with Japan, with Australia, with America. And France has no choice. France, I mean, I'm from France, and France has absolutely no interest in South China Sea. But still, our government, for the past 15 years, has been sending military boats in South China Sea to do maneuvers with the Philippines, with Japan, with Australia, with America. And this is completely against the national interest of France. And the Germans have been doing the same, and the British have been doing the same. It's completely against our national interest, but there's no choice. We must do it because America is actually directly threatening. And also America is trying to expand NATO into Asia now. I mean, when you think about it, NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It has nothing to do with Pacific Ocean, but now they're expanding into Asia. Last year, NATO wanted to open an office in Tokyo. And that was blocked by France. France said, no, this is going to antagonize China. So France said no. But all the other NATO countries were willing to open an office in Tokyo. So really we can see that the Anglo-American Empire is really uncomfortable with this multipolarity because it's not used to sharing the power. Now, there's one very interesting quote from Henry Kissinger who said, "It is dangerous to be the enemy of America, but to be a friend of America is even worse. It's actually lethal for you." And that was very interesting, and Europe should have paid more attention to that. Now, why am I saying that is because I want to share with you maybe something that you cannot see from the regular media, is that the EU is actually not a European project. The EU was created in 1954, but by two people who spent the entire Second World War in Washington, D.C. So the founding fathers of the EU are actually working for the U.S. And so it's not a homegrown project. It's a project that was sent from America to basically make sure that Europe would never be tempted to join the communist side. And if you remember, I don't know if you've read that, but actually the first director of NATO said that NATO was created in Europe to make sure that the Soviets are kept outside of Europe, the Americans are kept inside Europe, and the Germans are being held down. That was the actual purpose, the official purpose for the creation of NATO. And the EU is the exact same thing, but on the economic side. So you have one economic arm, and then you've got one military arm. But they all actually, basically, it's like left hand and right hand, and it's all controlled in Washington, D.C. So, and also the reason why for that is like Europe is like 27 countries, and for America to control 27 countries, it's very complicated because they all have their different opinions, different policies, different social development, so it's very difficult to control. And Henry Kissinger again said one day, he said, well, if I want to call Europe, who do I call? So we need to have some kind of central government, one telephone call, and I can tell Brussels what I want them to do, and they will make sure that 27 countries will do it. Also, the EU was sold to European countries as something of a peace project. After the Second World War, we'd never want to have war again, so let's all be friends and let's all work together. But actually, there is no friendship between European countries. I mean, the two biggest countries in Europe are France and Germany, and there is no French-German couple or engine or whatever. It just happens to be the two strongest economy, but they're always competing together within the EU. So this project was designed to make sure that America would have a grip on Europe and make sure that it will never get close to Russia and by extension to China. And I will come back to that later. So as I said, if you look at EU and NATO, they're both headquartered in the same city in Belgium, in Brussels, and it was supposedly a defensive organization. They said, well, NATO is to be able to defend ourselves against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But actually, if you look at that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, then NATO should have disbanded. But it didn't happen. What they did is they expanded to the east. And they had promised Gorbachev, the last leader of Soviet Union, they had promised that the NATO would never expand eastward. That was a promise that was made. And what happened actually is exactly the opposite. And if you look at here, the expansion, and now it's all the way at the border with Russia. And you could argue now that Ukraine, although it's not a member of NATO, but it's actually been a de facto NATO member because its army has been trained for the past 8 years by EU and by America. It's being provided equipment, military equipment from the West. So basically, Ukraine is right at the border with Russia and a NATO member. And this is something that Russia could not accept. But that's not the topic for today. So basically, the objective of EU and NATO was to forbid the strong development, economic links between Western Europe and Russia, and by extension, China. Now, so China is facing a dilemma because it's facing European countries, and it's always had, mostly for the contemporary history, China always had a good relationship with European countries, like individual European countries. But it has a very bad relationship with the EU, because the EU, as I said, is a Washington, D.C. controlled entity. So if you look at the speeches of the EU leaders, it's always very anti-China. We are talking about de-risking, decoupling. China is a systemic rival. All these things are very hostile. But China has these problems like, well, I have very good relationship with France and Germany and Italy and Spain and Hungary, but very bad relationship with their boss, which is the EU. So basically, for Europe, it's for European countries, it's almost a suicide to decouple from China, because this is where the future is. This is the biggest market in the world, and France and Germany always had a very good historical relationship. So right now, what's happening is that China has very unequal relationship with the EU, as I said, very hostile, but also with countries within the EU. It has a very strong and historical relationship with Germany and France, also from the technological point of view, because these two countries have been supplying a lot of technology to China in the past 30 years. But now these countries are talking about decoupling and de-risking because they're listening to Washington, D.C. But China is trying to manage a very good relationship with France. So if you remember when the German chancellor comes to China, or when the French president comes to China, China gives them a very red carpet treatment, very good relationship, because it's very important for China to have a good relationship with these countries. Then you have some other countries in Europe which are very hostile to China at the individual level. If you take, for instance, countries like the Baltic states, like Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Czech Republic, all these countries are very hostile to China because they were so close to Russia before that America now is telling them oh, you know what, maybe Russia is still your enemy, so I will protect you, you become part of NATO, but if I protect you, then you must be anti-China. So these countries are very anti-China, so you see they're doing provocations with Taiwan, for instance. Lithuania changed the name of its embassy in Taiwan to the official name of embassy. The same thing was done by Czech Republic. So these countries are very pro-NATO, pro-America within Europe. And then you have some other countries, such as Serbia and Hungary, which are have a very good relationship with China because they are very anti-NATO, and they are closer to Russia. They didn't suffer from the Soviet Union, so for them, being communist, a communist country is not a bad thing. They said, well, we can have good relationship with communist countries or with capitalist countries, it doesn't matter. So you really have three different levels of interaction between China and Europe. And so for China, you can imagine for the Chinese Waijiaopu, it must be very difficult to have a one policy because you have basically 27 countries following different directions. And so basically what happened is by being torn apart between America and Russia and China, the EU is being sacrificed for US hegemony. the EU is paying a very high price of being close to America. Look at what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline that was blown up, and everybody knows who did it. It's America who doesn't want Germany to keep buying gas from Russia. So that pipeline was blown up. You have this refugee crisis, terrorism. You've got the forced assistance, like France and Germany and all of Europe. They must pay billions of dollars to Ukraine to support America in its effort. So all of this is very almost suicidal for European countries. But as I said, there's no choice. It's all decided in Brussels, which means Washington, D.C. Yeah. And so who benefits from this European suicide? Well, basically, if you look at where the factories are moving, after Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, the factories in Europe have been closing down and reopening in the US, because the US is selling them cheap gas. So this is like a map of all the factories that have closed in Europe following Nord Stream pipeline blowing up, and all these companies closed down, have been moving most of them to the US. So you can really see that the policies of the EU are not benefiting the EU people. So you can see very clearly who's profiting from this crisis is the US. Those factories all moving to the US. And so China, as I said, so the EU is the European countries are losing their industry to America, but then China is trying to benefit from it by actually using some European countries to enter the European market. So basically, if you look at companies like BAD, they try to enter France. It didn't really work that well. So now they're moving everything to Hungary. So you have companies like BAD, you have companies like CATL who produce batteries. They're all going to Hungary because Hungary is a friendly country to China. So what are the global implications of all this? Well, as I said, imagine a world where Europe, Western Europe, Russia, and China would be working hand in hand. What would we have? We would have more skilled workers. We have all these new countries from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and all these countries. You would have these new skilled workers coming into the equation. You would have cheaper energy, Russian energy for everybody, right? For China, for Eastern Europe, Western Europe. You would have a seamless circulation of goods between Western Europe all the way to China, with all those corridors of transport. The Belt and Road Initiative, the North Sea route going to the North Pole. You have the North-South corridor. So with all these things together, we would have a new cycle of world economic growth. But it would not be dominated by the US. That's the problem. So that's why the integration of Eurasia, the good relationship between Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and China cannot be allowed by America, because this place would become the center of the world in terms of economy, in terms of everything. And so America would become what it is, basically. It's a big island. And it would still be powerful, it would still be very prosperous, but it would not be the center of the world. And that, of course, America cannot allow it. So that explains why America, for the past 20 years, pretty much a little bit before the Olympics of Beijing, America has been very aggressive and anti-China, trying to block China and contain China. And basically contain China within the South China Sea. Because if you think about it, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore, they can close. If they close that, China cannot do business with the rest of the world, because 80% of the merchandise made in China goes through the South China Sea. So that explains all the crises that you've been hearing about for the past 20 years. China is trying to unlock itself from the South China Sea, and which is why it's been developing the Belt and Road Initiative. And so when China is trying to create the Belt and Road Initiative, is basically trying to circumvent the South China Sea by going inland, using rail, using road, using boats going to the North Pole to avoid the South China Sea. And that explains all the conflicts you've heard. Afghanistan is related to that. Afghanistan is There was a war, the US invaded Afghanistan because there is a direct line between China, Afghanistan, and Iran, and China can reach the Indian Ocean like this without going through the South China Sea. Same thing with Xinjiang. What happened in Xinjiang is if they create trouble in Xinjiang, then China cannot use Xinjiang as a way to take the goods to Europe, right? Same thing with Armenia, same thing with Nord Stream pipeline, same thing with Pakistan. All this mess in Pakistan is because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. If China has a direct line to Pakistan, it can reach the Indian Ocean. Same thing with Myanmar, same thing with Thailand. All of this is related. All conflict you hear for the past 20 years is about America blocking China within the South China Sea. Here are all the roads I'm talking about. So here, this is the northeast, the north road going to the North Pole. This is all the rail and roads going through Central Asia. This is the one going from India all the way to Russia. You see, instead of going like this on the sea with the Suez Canal, which is easily blocked, now India is linking itself to Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia. And of course, China is right here. So if it's linked to Pakistan and India, then it's very easy to transfer the goods here. Same thing, South China Sea is right here. Now Thailand is building a canal where the boats can come from China, transit here, and then off to the Indian Ocean, right? So basically what America is doing right now is busy trying to contain China further, which explains the creation of new entities like AUKUS, which you've heard about, Australia, UK, and US. It's completely new. 5 years ago, it didn't exist. Also the Quad. Quad is this anti-China group between India, Japan, Australia, and the US, right? And also multiplying the flashpoints. Like if you look at the basically what the US is trying to do is to have some kind of conflict between China and one of its neighbors, right? So you have like the Diaoyutai, you have the Philippines, which you heard about, you have Myanmar, you have Pakistan, India, Ukraine. All of this is basically designed to create flashpoints that will impact China. And so, and then on top of that, this is the military stuff, but then of course on the economic side, then there's all this speech about decoupling from China, de-risking from China. And basically it means like cutting the Western world from China, And so there's the same thing. EU is the main loser of this, not America. EU is the main loser because, when they talk about, when Europe says we're going to impose 35% of tax on Chinese-made electric vehicles, well, it's big because 50% of electric vehicles imported in Europe are actually by Western brands. It's German brands, it's French brands produced in China, bring back to the European market, and then we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot. We are imposing tax on our own product. But when America says, we're going to put 100%, like Biden said, we'll put 100% of tax on Chinese-made electric vehicles, it means nothing because there's no Chinese electric vehicle imported in the US. So it's just an announcement before the elections, but has no implication for America. But it's giving pressure for EU to do the same, and this is hurting the EU economy. And this is pretty much what I wanted to share with you, and this is only a small part of my book, but I thought it would give you a good perspective of the relationship between China and Europe, especially because the relationship between China and US, you hear about it all the time. Thank you. Okay.
相信在座各位都從演講嘉賓身上獲益良多。如果你哋而家有任何問題向嘉賓發問，歡迎提問。場上嘅工作人員咧會向你哋遞咪。咁我哋呢一個環節係可以用英文或者普通話去發問都可以。
So far, the talk has been focusing on what served the best interest to the EU and China, which I know what the book's about. But I would like to ask, in your opinion, do you think the US current strategy of containing China and Russia is the best strategy for US own interest?
No, I think the US is using old thinking to address a new situation, and I mean, you can't really blame them for that. They haven't been used of having competition in the past 200 years of history. It's a new country, only 200 years of history, and he didn't really have competition until recently. So you can't blame them for using the same mindset to address this new position. But I think it's really also hurting the US in the long term, not in the short term, because right now they are using Europe as a buffer. So basically, they are hurting their allies to keep having a good economy. If you look at, I will take an example. We hear a lot about de-dollarization, right? The world is like using less and less of the US dollar. Like China and Russia, they do business in yuan. African countries and Middle East, they buy their oil they sell their oil in yuan, So you would think like, well, actually the dollar is losing its value, is losing its appeal. But actually it's not the case. If you look at SWIFT, the company that is doing the exchange of currencies, actually also based in Brussels. That's very interesting. They monitor the use of currencies, and for the past year, you realize that the dollar is being used more and more in the world. The yuan also is using more and more in the world, but the yuan is only 5% of the world transactions is used in yuan. But the currency that's been losing the most is the euro. Now is down to 27%. So basically, right now, the first step of this new dynamic that I talked about is not so much the US is not losing right now. Europe is losing, big time. But because, it's like you take from one pocket to put another. But the next step, when there's nothing to steal in Europe, then it will hurt America, because we've seen with Russia, all those sanctions. There's more than 12,000 sanctions against Russia right now. It doesn't work. Russia became a stronger economy because of that, because it becomes more self-sufficient, more self-reliant. And the same thing will happen with China if they start rolling out more and more sanctions on China. China will become more self-sufficient, and basically that's why I call the US the isolated hegemon. Because they keep saying Russia is isolated. That's what they say in the media. But if you look at who's really isolated more and more, it's America. The US is really becoming an island, and the rest of the world can't wait to find an opportunity to drop it. So you can't see it really right now, because the economy, the US economy is still booming. They have like full employment. The stock market is working like crazy. But this is all artificial. This is based on finance. This is based on printing money, and this is based on coercion with Europe and Japan. And Japan also is paying a big time price, for America to survive. But once there's nothing to take in Japan, when there's nothing to take in Europe, then America is going to follow the same path. That's what I think. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for the inspiring sharing. And after these few years, China reopened the tourists. Many Western tourists came to China and bring a lot of new insights to the Western public. Will that be any impact on the political side?
It's a very good question, because actually this is a very smart policy from China, because this is all related to soft power, right? And for the past 10, 15 years, China has been trying to do a Western-style soft power by, pushing its movies in the same direction as Hollywood, trying to promote them outside, opening a Confucius Institute, Kongzi Xueyuan, all over the world and everything. But this hasn't worked because Western countries are blocking it. So you can't really see Chinese movies, in American theaters. The Confucius Institutes are being closed down one after the other in Europe, in America. So the West understand that what China is trying to do and is blocking it. So the new policy of Xi Jinping is to say, well, you know what? If the media is hostile, if you don't want to see my movies, if you don't want to learn Chinese, if you don't want to know about Chinese culture, well, this is all what the media in the West and governments are saying in the Western countries. But what about the people themselves? What if I give people the choice to come to my country without a visa, no restriction. You can just take a plane ticket. Everything is convenient. You can pay with WeChat now. We accept foreign credit cards and everything. And so basically, it's making all those people, and there are a lot of people right now going to China. You can see this on YouTube, and all these people will become ambassadors of China. When they go back to their country, they will talk to their friends, they will talk to their colleagues who will tell them all the bad things they read in the news about China, and they will say, no, sorry, it's not like this. I've seen it. I just came back from China. It's not like this. China is not polluted like you're saying. China is not horrible in terms of human rights as you're saying. China is very, very, very developed. So it's transforming every tourist into an ambassador. And I think in the long term, this will have a political impact, as you're saying, because Western countries, it's all about elections, right? So when they will be talking about de-risking, cutting the links, the supply chain with China, the companies will say, no, I don't want this. And China is not a hostile country. China is a friendly country. Right now, you have some NGOs who are forcing Volkswagen to close their factory in Xinjiang. They say there is slave labor. I mean, come on, there is slave labor in a factory by Volkswagen in Xinjiang. I mean, who believes that, right? But this is the people who read this in the news in France or in Germany, they believe that. They'll say, oh, really? Oh, that's bad. But if they have some colleagues who just came back from there and say, no, absolutely not. I went to that factory and there is no slave labor. So then this is going to become more and more difficult for the Western media to lie about China. And actually, you already see the difference between the Western media, if it's European or if it's American. American Western media is just lying, it would just say anything, But they don't dare to be so bold in Europe, because you have a lot more people who travel to China in Europe than America. There's only 10% of Americans who have a passport, right? But in Europe, people travel a lot, So you can't really lie the way they lie in America, So you already start to see some change. And I think in the long term, because people vote, then they will have to adjust their speech and adjust the relationship with China.
Thank you for the talk and the presentation. First, I have two questions. The first is about, given the Russia and Ukraine's conflict for the last 2 years, and we can see the economy in the Western Europe is deteriorating because of the inflation and the cost of living, etc. So we see the recently election, the rise of the extreme right in a lot of the countries. So I would like to know your point of view on the impact on the EU side, and will expect any changes given going forward. The second is forthcoming if the U.S. leadership in the coming election is a change to the Republican. What you expect in terms of these great power play going forward? Thank you.
Yes, two very interesting questions. The first one is the impact of the Ukraine war in Europe, as you say, has been very negative because, as I said in the presentation, EU has no choice. It's being forced by America to support the war effort. So by sending billions of dollars, sending equipment, and sending troops now, to Ukraine. So this has been very detrimental to the Western people, to the Western Europe, and now. There is talk of having actually to send conscripts, like Germany, France, Italy are going to have conscription again in the army, which means compulsory military service. So taking young people and sending them to war to Ukraine. And of course, people are opposing this very much because they think, well, Ukraine, first, it's not our fight, it's not part of the EU, it's not part of NATO, so why should we fight for it, even though it's not far from Europe, but we don't need to go there. Second, more and more people realize that they've been lied about on Ukraine, just like they've been lied about on COVID and all those things. They say, look, Vladimir Putin didn't become crazy on February 24, 2022. There is a history before that, so you cannot blame Russia for what's happening right now. I mean, yes, there is an invasion, but there is a reason why there is an invasion, So the people more and more in Europe know about that. So there's big resistance. And so this resistance against the government, the puppet, I call them the puppet governments of Western Europe, has translated in the recent elections as in the rise of the far-right groups. Germany, AfD, France, the National Assembly. But the thing is, especially in Germany, that remains to be seen, but in France, look at what happened. The far right was by far the number one party at the first round of the election. But then you had 2 weeks in the middle, before the second round, and there's been a lot of backdoor deals and all that stuff. And the actual election process in France is designed since 1945 to block any far-right movement to emerge by allowing all the other political parties, even though they hate each other, they all have a coalition against the far right, which is what happened, and now it's the far left that's going to come to power. And basically Macron is going to stay in power. So, in the same way that you could look at the elections when Biden was elected, we remember, it took more than a month for America to confirm the results of the elections because it was pretty obviously a robbery, and a lot of cheating in the elections, in the counting of the votes and everything. It took more than a month to confirm. Even in Africa, they count the votes faster than America. But so, we have a big question mark on the elections in America in 2020, and definitely a big question mark on the election of the presidential elections in France, the last time Macron was re-elected. And here again, these elections, very dirty, a lot of dirty work, a dirty job behind the scene. And so basically that's what I'm saying, is that the Western countries are losing power. The narrative is becoming more and more difficult to support. People are against it, but then they will not let it go. They will not. The people who are in power, they are not going to let the power go to the other camp just because people put a piece of paper in a plastic box. The power will not be given away like this. It's going to have to be taken back, and that will be in the street. And this is what is going to happen in Europe. You already had a new kind of political protest in France. If you don't know if you remember, in 2018, they had the yellow vest people. It lasted for a very long time, and the police brutality against these people was huge. It was huge, and we have never seen so much police brutality in France since 1789. And so basically, that's what's going to happen. In all of Western Europe, you're going to see a rise of political dissent, political demonstrations, and there's going to be more and more violent repression from the police. And this actually, I know personally in France, people in the police force, they say the police force is buying equipment, anti-riot equipment like we've never seen before. Rubber bullets, tanks, everything, and very lethal equipment. So they are getting ready to really crush the dissent in European countries because they know the lie has gone too far. People don't believe in it. And now, as you said, inflation, poverty. Now people are starting to have nothing to lose, right? I can go to the street because anyway, I cannot feed myself. I cannot send my kids to good schools. I cannot buy a Christmas gift to my grandchildren. So now people go to the street and be very violent. That's the first thing. Then the second one is about Trump potentially being reelected in the U.S. and what implication it will have in this power play. I don't have any illusions about Donald Trump. I think he's just part of the game, just like Emmanuel Macron and all these Western leaders. As I say, I say they are basically actors for working for the deep state. There's a deep state in Western countries, which there isn't in China. In China, Xi Jinping is in power, and when he says something, something happens. In Western countries, think about it. Donald Trump's Twitter account was closed by the boss of Twitter. It obviously means that he's not the most powerful guy in America, right? So who's the most powerful guy in America or in Europe? We don't know. We kind of guess. We kind of know who it is. But anyway, we have to deal with all those puppet politicians. So if he's elected, I think in the long term, it's not going to change that much, but he will probably fine-tune the foreign policy of America because he can see that it's not working. So he's always been talking about bringing troops back home, and he did it with Afghanistan, you know. And I think what we can see is like, I think all these very hostile talking and actions towards China will be brought down, you know. Because if you remember the first time he was in power, he was very anti-China in speech. He's the one who said like, started the trade war and everything. But if you look at who actually implemented and created the new sanctions, it's the Biden administration, you know. It's like 10 times worse than what Trump did, you know. So I think Trump he has to say something bad about China, because in America you have to show the electorate that you're tough. I'm going to bring the jobs back. And he keeps saying now, it's like Taiwan is going to have to pay, you know, for protection because you have to pay for protection because you stole this cheap industry from us. And he says the same thing to Europe. Europe, you want protection? You're going to have to pay us now, NATO. You know, and I think people are very misled when they think like, oh, he's just like a mafia boss. He's collecting a protection fee. You know, I think he knows that Taiwan is not going to pay protection fee. He knows that European countries are not going to pay protection fee. So it's a way. It's giving him an excuse to pull out and say, well, you know what? They don't want to pay the protection fee, so I'm not protecting them. Because what you have to think is like Trump, he has to deal with the deep state, and who's the deep state? Is the military companies selling weapons, selling planes, and all that stuff. They want the war everywhere to keep selling the equipment. So he has to deal with them as well. He cannot say like, I want peace, let's get out of the South China Sea. He has to turn it around and say, you pay for your protection, if not, I'm not protecting you. All Taiwan has to say is, I don't need your protection. And that's it. And then there's no more justification for having troops in the region. Same thing with Europe. If Europe says, I don't need your protection, I don't believe Russia is threatening me, then what's the justification for having NATO expanding to more countries in Europe? You know? So I think he's very clever because he cannot go against his own deep state, because then he will have the same fate as Kennedy, and we saw it almost happen to him a week ago, you know? So he cannot do that, but also he knows that having confrontation with Russia, with China, cannot be done. It's too much. The American empire is overstretching itself. So I think my answer would be, I'm quite optimistic if Trump comes to power, because if you look at his first mandate, he didn't start any new war. He started to pull some troops back home, you know. And actually the trade war was a war of words, you know. The trade war with China became a real trade war when Biden came to power, not under Trump. So I suspect something similar will happen.
Hi, thanks for insightful talk. So what will you view India's position? India, yes. Thank you.
Well, India has a very sophisticated, let's say, position, because we know the relationship with China has always been confrontational. You know, it's not a good relationship. But at the same time, India doesn't want to be kind of a vassal state of America. It doesn't want to be a puppet like maybe Pakistan would. You could say Pakistan is much more pro-American than India. I think India is playing for itself. You know, although it's member of the BRICS, it's also member of the Quad. You know, so it has 1 foot in each. You know, it's 1 foot close to China, 1 foot close to America. And it's playing both sides. You know, basically, when he wants something from China, he says, "Well, if you don't give it to me, I could get closer to America." And same thing. You know, if you want me, you know, then I can go closer to China. So it's a very clever positioning, a little bit like what Turkey is doing. You know, they work for themselves mostly, and they play both sides. You know, and it's a very dangerous game, but it's very clever. You know, and I think it allows India to get something from both sides. You know, like Apple is, opening factories in India, but so does Oppo, and so does Chinese brands, you know. And so I think it's a clever game, but when you are playing on both sides like this, you will never become a superpower. You will always be a power in the middle, and you can tilt the balance, on one side or another one. But you will always be a second-rate power. So, but I think India is okay with that. I mean, I don't think India ever had the ambition to become a ruling superpower in the region. So as long as it's the South Asia big boss, it's fine with that.
I wanted to ask, last year's witnessed U.S.'s retreat from many countries, such as Afghanistan in 2020-21, and but now China's strategy is seeking economical cooperations with many other countries, but without building any military organizations. And I want to ask, is it possible for China to build military cooperations such as NATO, or are there any latent contradictions between China and Russia or Iran in the long term, especially if Putin wins the war in Ukraine? What will China respond?
Yes, that's a very broad question. It's interesting because I just released a video recently. Sorry, it's in French, but I released a video on the kind of the differences between NATO and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Because Shanghai Cooperation Organization at the very beginning was a security based organization. It was to fight what China used to call the three evils, right? The separatism, religious extremism, and terrorism, right? So it was like 6 countries at the beginning, and it was purely military matters and security matters, So you could say it was a kind of an Asian or Central Asian NATO, But what's interesting is that it's been developed as something much bigger than this, and now it's addressing economic issues, political, cultural, people-to-people exchange and everything. And I think it's very clever because here again, NATO is it's calling itself a defensive organization, but we see it's actually very offensive. It's invading countries. It's been going to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to many other countries. It bombed Serbia. It bombed Libya. So it's very aggressive. And I think because this Shanghai Cooperation Organization was created in China, and it's actually headquartered in Beijing, it cannot be seen, China doesn't want it to be seen as an aggressive military outfit, so it's actually adding more cooperation, and Vladimir Putin said it in his speech in Astana 2 weeks ago, which was the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He said basically, if we want to make sure that security and is protected in Eurasia, then we have to make sure that there is prosperity, because if people are poor, they have nothing to lose, and they're very easily convinced to become religious extremists or things like that. But if everybody has a prosperous life, and then there is it's very difficult for extremist religious to have a hold in these countries. This is what happened in Central Asia and Xinjiang, for many years, And then when Xinjiang economy started to pick up, then it's there's no more speech of separatism or terrorism, So China, as opposed to Western countries like as America, only has one military base in the world, in Djibouti, in Africa. It's actually right next to the American base and right next to the French base, But somehow the West is complaining about it, saying, "Oh, you see, China is becoming, expanding, and it's being very aggressive." Only one base in the world, But I think China will not replicate this because Beijing government really doesn't want to be seen as the next superpower, unipolar superpower. It will not replicate the mistakes that America did, So creating bases all around the world doesn't make any sense, because then what the Western media would say is true. You are becoming aggressive and overexpanding. It's the same thing with weapons. If you look at the weapons from China, yes, China is building up its arsenal because it has to. Because of if the Seventh Fleet was not in the South China Sea, China wouldn't need to build 4 aircraft carriers. The reason why it's doing it is because America is provoking it constantly and building all those bases. But if you look at the number of aircraft carriers compared to America, it's nothing. If you look at the number of nuclear missiles, it's nothing compared to America. China has like maybe 500. America has 8,000. So it's not competing for this military might. But it has to be defending itself. So China is doing this. Did I answer your question, or is something missing?
Possible contradictions between China and Russia.
Right. The relationship between China and Russia is not as good as what the Western media says, right? The Western media says China and Russia are allied. It's a new axis of evil with North Korea and Iran, right? All of this is basically Western lies again, trying to scare people and say like, oh, there's this force of evil building in the East, But the relationship between China and Russia is actually much more pragmatic. And both China and Russia have said, we do not have an alliance. We don't want to have an alliance in the style of NATO, because the Article 5 of NATO states that if one country of NATO is attacked, all the other countries must attack as well. So basically, it's a loss of sovereignty. Because let's say Poland is attacked by Russia, it means that France has to go to war with Russia. But that's not sovereignty, because France has no interest in Poland, right? So why would France go to war for Poland? So this Article 5 of NATO is an alliance, and China and Russia, they don't want something like this, because they say, well, yes, we have a strategic partnership right now, and it's very limited because China is not selling weapons to Russia. Yeah, you could say it's selling parts that you can make weapons with. But then by that logic, you could say that China selling food to Russia is also helping the war, because you can give that food to the soldiers, right? So this is kind of ridiculous. China is making sure that it's not being drawn into the war in Ukraine because it wants to remain sovereign. This is the number one thinking of countries like Russia, China, Iran, is that they are sovereign. They don't want to be told what to do, even by friends. Even though Russia and China have a friendly relationship, China doesn't want to go to war in Ukraine because of Russia, because Russia has not been always a friend. It's a friend right now. It's an ally right now. It's kind of a partner right now. But who knows in the future? Yeah. And as somebody said, I think it was Churchill who said, countries don't have friends; they only have interests, right? And this is something that is very much in the mind of the Chinese leadership, and absolutely not in the mind of the Western leadership. Western leadership always talking about friends and allies and whatever, but it's basically saying they don't have any sovereignty. So if Russia wins the war, I would say when Russia wins the war in Ukraine, because it's pretty much already done, I think it's very good for China, because China didn't intervene physically in that conflict. It's being accused by the Western media, but it doesn't carry any weight, And it will then make sure that Russia will help China if something bad happens in the South China Sea. And this question of the South China Sea, I think, will be more on the side of Philippines. They keep talking about Taiwan. I was in Taiwan yesterday. I was talking to a lot of people about that. Nobody in Taiwan believes there will be a war between China and Taiwan, But the Western media keeps propping this up. The Philippines could be eventually more potentially dangerous, But then China will have the support of Russia, maybe not military support, but kind of logistical support, So I think it's good for China.
今日非常感謝咁多位嚟到我哋呢一度咧，都非常感謝羅文教授嚟到為我哋進行一個精彩嘅分享。為表謝意，我哋有請香港貿易發展局代表向羅文教授頒頒註紀念品。
Thank you.